Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we ease into a story that curls like smoke from the candle beside your bed, twisting, flickering, refusing to straighten itself into something simple or comforting. You're about to wander into the dim corridors of palaces where the walls are covered in velvet, and yet the air feels stale, heavy with the sighs of too many generations marrying too close to home. The tale is not one of heroic knights or glorious queens riding out to cheering crowds. It is instead the tale of a queen whose body itself became the canvas of dynastic folly. Bent, hunched, crooked, she was carried like a burden into her own throne room, the living symbol of incestuous ambition. And here you are, preparing to follow her shadow. You probably won't survive this. Not the way she had to, with a back that curved under the weight of her ancestors' decisions, with a face that reflected a dynasty's jawline gone to caricature. No, you're safe in your bed, not under the scrutiny of 1,000 painted eyes staring down from gilded frames. But it will unsettle you, the way her story takes shape. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since we're whispering together across distance, why not let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now? I always imagine these words drifting across time zones. Some of you awake with coffee, others half asleep under blankets, phones dangling dangerously close to your noses. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the world of Europe's most famous royal families, where surnames like Habsburg, Bourbon, and Trastamara carried more weight than entire nations. These were dynasties obsessed with purity, though not the kind of purity modern doctors or geneticists would ever recommend. No, this was the purity of keeping bloodlines untainted by outsiders. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and children were born with jaws too large for their faces, hips too narrow for childbirth, and backs that bent under invisible burdens. Historians still argue whether the kings and queens of these bloodlines understood the risks or simply refused to acknowledge them, as if royal blood could magically defy nature's limits. You imagine a nursery where an infant cries, its cry thin and reedy, the nursemaid exchanging nervous glances with the midwife. The midwife knows the child's head looks too large, the jaw already prominent, the tiny body oddly stiff. She has seen this before. She has buried too many small coffins carried out the back doors of palaces. Yet no one speaks of it aloud. The official record will call the child robust, strong, or blessed. But the walls, if they could talk, would whisper the truth. This is the world you step into tonight. One where the body of a queen, especially one who was misshapen, was never just her own. It was political currency, a canvas for caricature, and an omen for her dynasty. Her hump, her bent spine, her fragile health, these were not private afflictions. They were the gossip of Europe, the symbols painted into satirical pamphlets, the whispered proof that God himself had cursed the family line. But pause here and picture the other side. Imagine her as a child, perhaps playing with dolls carved of ivory and wood, each dressed in miniature silk. She bends awkwardly, her back already aching, yet she still arranges them neatly as children do. The nursery windows look out on courtyards filled with soldiers drilling, falcons screeching from their perches, fountains churning water into the air. She is not yet a queen, only a girl, and she does not understand that her very body is being measured like grain in a merchant's hand. She only knows that her governor scolds her when she slumps, that corsets dig painfully into her ribs in the name of posture, and that when she walks people look too long before remembering their manners. History rarely allows queens to be children. They are born daughters of dynasties, betrothed before they can speak, schooled not in play but in politics, and when a queen is misshapen the childhood is even shorter, for every awkward movement becomes a political metaphor. One ambassador might write in a letter, "Her Majesty appears weak, unlikely to bear heirs." Another might scoff, "The crookedness of her form reflects the crookedness of her family tree." And so the girl grows up under two spotlights at once, one as a child aching to be normal, another as a monarch-to-be already dissected by strangers. The mainstream fact you can clutch like a candle is this: dynastic inbreeding was not a rumour, but a documented strategy, particularly among the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in the mid-17th century, he carried such a dense concentration of Habsburg blood that he was described by contemporaries as grotesque, unable to chew, walk, or produce heirs. That family line crumbled under the weight of its own genetic bottleneck. The Hunchback Queen you're meeting tonight is cut from that same woven cloth of two close marriages. The quirky tidbit, the one you tuck under your pillow for later, is that some physicians of the day truly believed physical deformities in royalty were divine messages. A hunchback. Perhaps God bent her body as a warning against pride. A twisted jaw? Maybe heaven was mocking the vanity of portrait painters. Court astrologers would align crooked bones with crooked stars, suggesting that the Queen's back bent because Saturn had turned its gaze too sharply during her conception. Modern doctors would roll their eyes, of course, but back then such theories determined how people prayed and feared. You linger with the open scholarly debate. Was she truly monstrous, as enemies described, or were her deformities exaggerated by politics and gossip? Historians still argue whether the surviving descriptions are reliable. Some letters call her severely disfigured, others only mention slight curvature. One ambassador might have described her as grotesque purely to make her dynasty look weak in comparison to his own royal employers, and yet enough accounts converge on the image of a hunched back that the nickname clung to her like a burr. You wander through a candlelit corridor in your imagination. Along the walls hang tapestries of royal hunts, men on horseback with lances, dogs straining at leashes, stags leaping in terror. And then, in the midst of this celebration of power and symmetry, she appears. Your queen, bent at the waist, her gown heavy with embroidery, pearls sewn along the bodice. The pearls gleam in perfect spheres, mocking the irregular curve beneath. Nobles bow as she passes, but their eyes slide sideways, whispering later over wine. She feels it. You feel it too. And here's where your gentle sarcasm sneaks in. Because really, if you think your family gatherings are awkward, imagine hers. You think your uncle's jokes at Thanksgiving are unbearable? Try having your uncle as your husband and your cousin as your mother-in-law. It's like a family reunion where the seating chart is drawn by a deranged genealogist with a sense of dark humour. You wouldn't survive that, not even with extra mashed potatoes. Still, you press forward, because tonight is about more than the gossip. It's about understanding how power bends bodies as surely as it bends spines. The Queen's body was not private. It was spectacle, symbol, sacrifice. Her pain, her awkwardness, her bent shoulders, all of it was wrapped in velvet and presented as part of the dynastic display. And as you lay in your bed, eyelids heavy, you realise that what bends most here is not only her spine but the truth itself, warped by politics, superstition, and centuries of retelling. The night stretches out ahead, the tale only beginning. You've met the Queen at the threshold, glimpsed her shadow, felt the weight of her ancestors pressing down upon her crooked frame. Soon you will follow her into the heart of dynasties that close their gates too tightly, strangling themselves with their own obsession. But for now, let your breathing slow, your thoughts settle, and picture her, not just as a hunchback queen, but as a girl in a nursery, arranging her ivory dolls, wishing her body would obey her, wishing her destiny could bend in another direction. You slide further into the dim corridors of history, where royal families treated the world like a closed box, drawing the lid tighter and tighter until no fresh air could get in. You can almost hear the hinges creak, the stale air pressing down on the gilded courts of Europe. And at the centre of this suffocating box sits the idea that marrying outside one's own royal circle was unthinkable, almost vulgar. Kings and queens feared contamination by common blood, so they reached instead for the nearest cousin, the closest niece, sometimes even their own uncle or aunt, as if the family tree were less a tree and more a snake devouring its tail. You picture yourself walking through one of those royal wedding feasts, long tables grown with roasted peacocks, gilded sugar sculptures, rivers of spiced wine. The scent of clove and cinnamon hangs heavy, imported from ships that risked storms and pirates. Courtiers laugh, ambassadors toast, musicians pluck lutes in cheerful melodies. But if you look closely, you'll see the guest list is strange. The groom's mother is also his aunt. The bride's grandmother doubles as her cousin once removed. Everyone is related, some in more than one way. It's less a wedding than a family reunion with uncomfortable paperwork. The practice had a practical face. Dynasties sought to preserve wealth, territory, and divine legitimacy. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria perfected this game. By marrying within their family circle, they kept their empire sprawling across Europe without needing outsiders to chip away at it. The blood of kings, they believed, was too precious to dilute. Better to risk the occasional limp or infertility than risk losing land to a rival house. But the bodies told a different story. The mainstream fact sits plainly before you. Charles II of Spain, perhaps the most famous victim of dynastic inbreeding, had only 16 great-great-grandparents instead of the usual 32. His family tree looped back on itself so many times that by the time he reached adulthood, he was unable to chew properly, had epileptic fits, and could not father children. His reign ended the Spanish Habsburg line. This is not rumour, not exaggeration, but documented tragedy. An emperor embodying the limits of human genetics long before genes were understood. And yet, you can't help but smirk a little when you realise how they bragged about this. Ambassadors boasted of purity of blood, as though they had bottled it like a fine wine. If only they had the warning labels we put on today's products. May contain excessive cousins. Side effects include jaw protrusion, fertility issues, and entire dynasties collapsing. You wouldn't put that on the royal dinner menu, but it should have been there in bold print. The quirky tidbit to tuck under your pillow tonight is this. In some royal circles they considered it romantic, yes, romantic, to marry a cousin. The idea was that no outsider could ever understand you better than someone who shared not just your upbringing, but your exact lineage. Cousin marriage love poems were composed celebrating the union of blood with blood. To modern ears it sounds unsettling, but for them it was like a dynastic hallmark card. To my cousin, my beloved, our blood flows as one. Try reading that aloud on Valentine's Day. You'll clear the room faster than you can blow out the candles. And then you linger with the open scholarly debate. Did these dynasties know they were crippling themselves, or did they truly believe divine right insulated them from biology? Historians still argue whether royal advisors whispered warnings, or whether everyone convinced themselves that God's chosen rulers couldn't possibly suffer from the same natural laws as farmers or peasants. Perhaps some physicians suspected patterns, too many stillbirths, too many twisted spines. But who was going to walk into the throne room and say, "Majesty, maybe it's time to marry someone outside the family"? Careers ended, and heads rolled for far less. You shift the scene in your imagination. A winter's night in Vienna, torches flickering against palace walls. Inside, a council gathers, candles throwing shadows across oak tables. Maps of Europe spread wide, dotted with crowns marking potential marriages. One noble suggests a French princess. Another scoffs. Too far, too foreign, too risky. Instead, they circle back to the Archduke's niece, or the king's cousin, or the widowed sister-in-law. The circle closes again, tighter and tighter. You can almost hear the scratching of quills as family names repeat across parchment like an echo chamber. And in that chamber, the Hunchback Queen's fate was sealed long before her birth. Her parents' union was not one of passion, but of political necessity. Her grandparents, too, had been paired not for love but for inheritance maps. Generation after generation the choices narrowed, until a child emerged with bones that bent too easily, a spine that curved against the weight of expectation. Her very body was the footnote to centuries of political strategy. Here your modern aside sneaks in. You think your family is complicated because you can't remember the name of your third cousin who shows up at weddings. Try being part of a family where your third cousin is also your brother-in-law and your uncle. Thanksgiving dinner would require not one seating chart, but an entire legal team with flowcharts and footnotes. And when arguments broke out, you couldn't even storm off, because every door led to yet another relative. But back to the palace corridors where our queen grew up. Imagine her as a girl listening to these discussions, absorbing the logic without fully understanding it. She sees her cousins paired off like chess pieces, hears her name whispered as part of negotiations she can't control. She doesn't yet know her back will bend, but already her future is bent, shaped by dynasties that thought bloodlines mattered more than breathing. The walls of these palaces remember everything. They remember the laughter at cousin weddings, the anxious whispers when another infant was stillborn, the triumph when land was secured by yet another incestuous match. And they remember the girl with the curved spine, whose childhood giggles echoed briefly before being stifled by duty. You trudge onward, your eyelids heavy now, lulled by the rhythm of history's mistakes repeating like a lullaby sung off key. And you can almost see her in the distance, carried into the court not as a child anymore but as a young queen-to-be, her back already bent, her destiny already decided, a crooked figure walking down a straight, merciless aisle. You keep drifting forward, and the air grows heavier, as though it thickens with each name echoing down the genealogical tunnel. You begin to notice that when portraits line the walls of these palaces, they seem to stare back at you with uncanny sameness. The men and women differ in age, in their velvet garments, in the weapons or sceptres posed in their hands, but the faces blur, prominent lips, jutting jaws, receding chins, as if the same sculptor had been asked to repeat his work over and over, only slightly varied, like a wax mould used too many times. This is the infamous Habsburg jaw, technically known as mandibular prognathism, a defining feature bred into generation after generation, until it became a grotesque family emblem. When ambassadors described monarchs in coded letters, they often noted the distinguished chin or proud jawline. Behind those polite euphemisms lurked the truth: mouths that could not fully close, jaws so misshapen that chewing food was a labour, speech often garbled, and yet the family insisted it was a badge of distinction. You imagine standing in a grand hall, paintings looming above, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of Spain, Maria Anna of Austria. Their eyes follow you, but so do their jaws, protruding slightly forward, lips never quite meeting. It's eerie, like walking among wax figures in a dim museum where each head is tilted just so, emphasising the chin as though it were a crown itself. Here's your solid historical fact to anchor yourself. Geneticists analysing the Habsburg family tree estimate that their high rate of inbreeding, between 9% and 20% over generations, directly contributed to the pronounced jaw deformity. The condition isn't unique to them. It occurs naturally in populations worldwide. But within the Habsburgs, it became exaggerated by deliberate consanguineous marriages. When Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, his jaw was so misshapen that he could barely speak or eat without difficulty. His contemporaries wrote openly of his physical weakness, and he became the living symbol of a dynasty's decline. But here's a quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle in the quiet of your room. In certain courtly circles, that jaw was advertised as a mark of superiority. Some painters even accentuated it in portraits to show off dynastic pride. Imagine commissioning a flattering Instagram filter today that makes your chin longer. You'd be swiping left faster than you could blink. But in their world, the jutting chin was a brand, a logo of sorts, stamped onto faces to remind everyone of centuries of pure blood. If you think modern brand loyalty goes too far, wait until you realise people once flaunted difficulty chewing as a power symbol. And then comes the scholarly debate, still murmured among historians. Were the portraits accurate, or were they exaggerations intended for propaganda, either flattering or mocking? Historians still argue whether Spanish and Austrian painters softened the jawline for domestic audiences, while foreign caricaturists sharpened it into grotesque parody. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. Real deformities, exaggerated by rumour and brushstroke, until the image of the Habsburg jaw became inseparable from the dynasty's very name. You picture our hunchback queen staring into her own mirror, her lips pressed tight against the protruding shape of her teeth. For her, it was not just a family feature, but a cruel inheritance layered upon her already bent back. She might have been taught to view her face as noble, her jawline as a mark of legitimacy. Yet when she smiled, or tried to, the servants noticed how the expression twisted, how laughter sometimes garbled into a sound less melodic than expected. She must have felt it, the way her reflection bore centuries of choices made not for her, but by ancestors obsessed with empire. And here your gentle sarcasm nudges you again. You've complained about inheriting your dad's bad knees, or your mum's nose. But imagine inheriting every relative's jaw at once, all layered together like a genealogy chart turned into bone. You'd never win a schoolyard fistfight. They'd just call you Royal Chin and you'd be done. Yet in those palaces it was not an insult. It was destiny. Walk with me into a banquet hall. The Queen sits at the high table, servants carrying trays of roasted fowl, honey cakes and sugared almonds. She reaches for her goblet, hands delicate, her spine curving slightly as she bends. When she tries to eat, each bite takes effort, the jaw grinding awkwardly, teeth never quite aligning. She perseveres, for etiquette demands it, but the act of eating becomes theatre. Watchers noting her struggle, whispering whether she will be able to bear strong airs if even dinner seems a battle. Her face flushes under candlelight, not from wine but from the effort of pretending it costs her nothing. The Habsburg jaw was more than biology, it was politics painted across skin. Rival courts mocked it openly, suggesting it symbolised weakness, while allies defended it as divine distinction. Pamphlets circulated with satirical drawings, chins so long they scraped the floor, lips dragging across banquet tables. Enemies of the dynasty used the deformity as proof of divine punishment. Supporters countered that beauty standards differed, and that what outsiders called grotesque, insiders called noble. The truth, as always, bent in the wind of politics. Pause a moment here and let your mind wander. Imagine if, centuries later, you scroll through a family photo album and realise that one feature repeats so often it looks uncanny. For the Habsburgs, it wasn't uncanny. It was deliberate. They designed it that way, generation after generation, until their heirs carried not just crowns but bones reshaped by obsession. Our hunchback queen, born into this legacy, bore the double weight, a back that curved visibly and a jaw that pushed forward defiantly. To her enemies she was monstrous. To her supporters she was a necessary link in the chain. But to herself, well, that's the part history rarely records. Did she sit in her chambers late at night, candles guttering, touching her jaw with her fingers, trying to imagine what it might feel like to smile without strain? Did she dream of being unseen, just another woman in the market, free to walk unnoticed, free to laugh without politics embedded in her face? As you lay here, eyelids drooping, think of the irony. In their attempt to preserve power, the Habsburgs made themselves memorable not for glory or grandeur, but for a jawline so infamous it still echoes through textbooks. And in the centre of that legacy, your hunchback queen became both symbol and victim, her body bent not just by bone but by centuries of choices carved into her very flesh. You probably wouldn't survive it. Not the politics, not the feasts where every bite is scrutinised, not the mirrors that never reflect your own face, but rather the ghosts of ancestors staring back. You can survive your own quirks, your own family features, because at least no one uses them to judge whether nations will rise or fall. But for her, every crooked smile was empire. The night stretches deeper, and still her shadow follows you. Curved back, protruding chin, a living monument to dynasties without outsiders. You'll see her more clearly soon, walking into her court beneath velvet canopies, every floor disguised in pearls, every gesture heavy with scrutiny. You drift deeper into the story, and the air feels thinner now, as though the oxygen itself has been diluted by too many repeated breaths within the same chambers. This is the air our hunchback queen was born into, an atmosphere already exhausted, already fragile. You notice it most clearly in the bones, not just hers, bent and curved, but in the bones of her brothers, sisters, cousins, so many of them brittle as glass, snapping under the faintest pressure of life. In these royal nurseries, midwives knew the sound of tiny ribs cracking. They knew how to swaddle infants not too tightly, how to cradle heads that seemed too large for the bodies beneath them. Cradles lined with satin and lace could not soften the truth. These were children of dynasties that had squeezed their family tree until the branches grew crooked. To be born royal here was not to be born strong. It was to be born under constant watch for signs of weakness. Here's your candle flame of a fact. Across the Habsburg lines, infant mortality soared compared to common households. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, nearly half of royal children died before reaching adolescence. Fragile skeletons, hydrocephalic heads, jaws that could not close, hips too narrow to deliver heirs. For a family whose survival depended on producing strong successors, this fragility was a curse written into the body itself. Picture a winter morning in a palace nursery. Frost creeps across the window panes, but inside, fires crackle. Nurses bustle quietly, checking swaddles, whispering prayers under their breath. In one cradle lies a boy who coughs violently, his ribs rattling audibly. In another, a girl stirs but cannot straighten her legs. You linger by the cradle of our queen-to-be, who shifts uneasily, her spine already showing hints of curvature, her shoulders not sitting evenly. The nursemaid sighs, adjusts her blankets, and tells herself it's nothing. But deep down she knows. The quirky tidbit you'll tuck away is that physicians of the time sometimes recommended truly bizarre remedies for weak bones. One suggestion: grind up powdered skulls or mummy dust, literal remains taken from Egyptian tombs, and mix them into wine for the child to sip. Another: feed broth made from boiled stag horns, because antlers were thought to transfer strength. There's even record of prescribing crocodile dung dried and pressed as an all-purpose cure. So yes, while you may complain about your modern vitamin gummies tasting too chalky, imagine choking down ground-up antlers, or someone else's 1,000-year-old jawbone. If nothing else, it would make you appreciate Flintstone's vitamins. Yet, there's a debate historians still circle around. Were these fragile bones truly the inevitable outcome of inbreeding, or did other factors, poor hygiene, malnutrition, constant plagues, play an equal role? Scholars still argue whether the Habsburg children were uniquely cursed, or simply victims of the same diseases that thinned populations across Europe. After all, even peasant families lost children frequently. But in royal families, every failure was magnified, every crooked limb scrutinised as a metaphor for political weakness. Imagine now a physician bending over the Queen's cradle, adjusting his spectacles. He scribbles in Latin notes about the curvature he observes, but he phrases it gently for the record: a delicate frame. When he steps outside to brief the regent or king, he adds quietly, the child may not thrive. And yet the cradle remains in the centre of the nursery, draped in silk, as if beauty could disguise fragility. Our queen grew up in this atmosphere where childhood was a test of survival, and few passed it. Each birthday she reached was celebrated more like a military victory than a family gathering. Candles on her cake, if she had one, burned not with joy but with relief. Another year, another step closer to being useful to the dynasty. Her siblings and cousins, those who faltered, were buried quickly, their names noted in registers but rarely remembered. She survived, bent but unbroken, her bones fragile but persistent enough to carry her into womanhood. You may laugh lightly at your own clumsiness, stubbing toes, twisting ankles, but for her a fall could mean months of pain, a bone cracked too easily. Every step she took across those polished palace floors carried the weight of caution. Perhaps that's why she moved stiffly, why she always seemed to tilt slightly forward, not only because of her back, but because she was perpetually guarding herself against collapse. At banquets, courtiers feasted on venison and lamb, but physicians might limit her to softer foods, lest her jaw tire too quickly. While other girls in the court danced to violins, she moved more slowly, her body not able to whirl as they did. Yet she remained visible, forced into the spotlight, because queens could not hide. Even fragility had to be displayed in silk. And here your sarcasm bubbles gently. You think gym class was embarrassing? Try being a teenager at court when the whole empire is analysing your posture like it's a stock market chart. One slip, one stumble, and whispers spread to every ambassador within earshot. She cannot bear airs, she will not last. Meanwhile, you trip once in dodgeball and only your classmates snicker, count your blessings. But this isn't just pity, it's also power. Fragility made her dangerous in another way. A dynasty built on fragile bones teetered always on collapse, and rivals circled hungrily. Her existence, her survival, forced treaties to shift, marriages to be renegotiated, alliances to wobble. Fragile though she was, she carried the weight of nations in her slight bent frame. You lean closer into the hush of history and wonder. Did she ever know just how fragile her line was? Did she hear her governess mutter prayers louder than necessary, or her confessor whisper about divine curses? Did she sense that every illness, every ache, sent ripples through the palace like cracks in marble? Tonight, as you lie there with your own bones cushioned safely by blankets and mattress, imagine the sharp contrast. Her bones, fragile yet burdened, her body a living metaphor for a dynasty pressing itself to the breaking point. She did not ask for that weight, but she bore it, crooked, cautious, persistent. And so you drift with her, step by slow step, deeper into a life where fragility was not weakness, but survival against the odds. Her bones, though fragile, carried her long enough to be crowned long enough to become the queen whose shadow still bends across your dreams tonight. You walk deeper into the hush of candlelit halls, and there she is, still a child, but already a shadow in her own court. The nursemaids lift her carefully, not because she's delicate like porcelain, but because her body does not sit as straight as theirs. She tilts, her shoulders uneven, her back forming a curve that no corset can disguise. You hear the whispers first in the nursery, carried not in words meant for her, but in words she was never supposed to understand. Misshapen, crooked, born bent. The labels cling like cobwebs, sticking fast before she even knows what they mean. This is where her story sharpens. She is no longer simply fragile, she is marked. Royal children often had quirks or weaknesses, but most could be trained into obscurity. A stutter might be glossed over, weak lungs hidden behind courtiers' fanning, but a hunch, a curve in the spine, that could not be erased. Her body announced itself before she even spoke. Imagine her walking, slowly, carefully in the marble corridors of the palace. Other children run, their laughter echoing off vaulted ceilings. She follows, not at their pace, but in stiff little steps. Her head bows slightly forward, as though she's already apologising for existing. And yet, she keeps going. Here's your grounding historical fact. Scoliosis and kyphosis, curvatures of the spine, were known in early modern Europe, though rarely understood. Physicians wrote of children bent like bows, or crooked in stature. Treatments ranged from tightly laced corsets to brutal stretching devices that promised correction but delivered pain. Among royals, such conditions were both medical and political. A queen's body had to symbolise health and fertility. A hunched back was not only a personal struggle, it became an omen of dynastic decline. And then the quirky tidbit, almost unbelievable but true, some medieval and early modern doctors genuinely believed hunchbacks were lucky. The hump was thought to hold excess strength, even magical protection. Beggars with curved spines sometimes hired themselves out for good luck at weddings or markets. There are accounts of gamblers rubbing a hunchback's back before throwing dice, convinced it would improve their odds. Imagine our young princess, bent and self-conscious, overhearing such beliefs. Did she ever wonder if her hump was her curse or her secret power? If she could only reach across centuries, she'd make a fortune renting herself out at Las Vegas poker tables. But the scholarly debate still lingers. Was her condition truly severe, or exaggerated by hostile observers? Historians still argue whether the term hunchback attached to her was a literal description of a pronounced curvature, or a metaphor crafted by rivals who wanted to paint her dynasty as monstrous. After all, satire was the social media of the day. Pamphlets could ruin reputations as easily as portraits could sanctify them. Did she have a slight curve exaggerated into grotesquerie, or did her body truly bend as harshly as the rumours claimed? You imagine her governess adjusting her gown before she greets visiting envoys. Heavy fabric drapes across her small shoulders, weighted down with embroidery and pearls. The governess tugs, pulls, straightens, trying to disguise what cannot be hidden. The child squirms, uncomfortable, her ribs pressed tight by stays. When she finally walks into the chamber, her steps are deliberate, her eyes lowered. Courtiers bow, but their gazes linger too long on the uneven line of her shoulders. She feels their stare like heat burning her skin. And here you slip in your gentle sarcasm. You thought middle school was rough, with kids whispering about your haircut or your braces. Try being 9 years old, and having ambassadors from half of Europe writing letters home about your posture. Her Highness has a bent frame, they'd scribble, sealing the report with wax, sending it off to kings and dukes who never even met her. Meanwhile, you thought you had it bad when one embarrassing photo went around Snapchat. The palace was a place of both splendour and cruelty. By day she played among fountains and tapestries, but by night she overheard whispers, servants gossiping, noblewomen murmuring. Even if the words weren't clear, the tone was unmistakable. Pity, disdain, mockery. She was the child called misshapen, and in a world where queens were expected to embody divine perfection, that was a burden heavier than any crown. Picture her at lessons. Tutors recite Latin declensions, drill her in courtly manners. She writes carefully with a quill, her small hand cramping. Yet even here, her posture betrays her. Tutors gently urge her to sit straighter. Don't slouch, child. But it is not slouching. It is her spine itself. curved as though moulded by invisible hands. She sits as straight as she can, her back aching, knowing she will never pass for normal. And yet, she is clever. Royal daughters were often educated in multiple languages, politics, and etiquette. She absorbs it all, perhaps even more fiercely because she knows her body will always betray her. If she cannot dazzle with beauty or grace, she must arm herself with wit and strategy. There are stories, half fact, half rumour, of royal women who turned physical disadvantage into intellectual or spiritual authority. Perhaps she saw herself in those whispered tales and vowed not to be merely the subject of pity. Still, nights were hardest. Alone in her chamber, candles burning low, she lay in her bed and felt the ache in her back. Every shift sent a reminder that she was different. Did she pray for straightness? Did she imagine waking up transformed? The saints looked down from painted panels, serene and upright, their halos glowing. She must have wondered if heaven made a mistake, or if heaven had marked her deliberately. Your mind drifts with her through those nights. The weight of silk blankets pressing on her chest, the flicker of shadows against carved ceilings. She turns, winces, curls into herself. Outside, the palace slumbers, but inside her body is a quiet storm, bones misaligned, muscles straining, and yet she breathes, endures, persists. The cruel irony is that the world remembers her most for the word misshapen, but in those quiet moments she was simply a child, curious, tender, wanting affection. She might have loved the soft fur of a spaniel at her feet, the taste of sugared almonds stolen from a tray, the sound of music drifting from distant halls. Her body was bent, but her humanity was not broken. And as you lie here, eyelids heavy, you realize the lesson pressing against your thoughts. Children, no matter their shape, carry the same desires, to belong, to be seen, to be loved. She was called misshapen, but she was more than that. She was a girl navigating a world that had no patience for imperfection, and yet she carried herself forward, step after painful step, toward a throne that would never let her rest. You wouldn't survive it. Not the whispers, not the endless scrutiny, not the heavy gowns disguising what couldn't be hidden. But she did. She survived her childhood, bent but unbroken, stepping into the harsh light of court life where her back would always curve and her shadow would always stretch crooked across the palace floor. You follow her now into the age when childhood gives way to the cold stage of public life. No more nurseries, no more whispers only among nursemaids. She is presented at court and every eye sharpens. The palace doors swing open, music rises and she steps forward. But the moment should have been triumph is instead shadowed, for she cannot stride with the straightness expected of queens. She enters veiled, her posture stiff, her back curved under embroidered silk. In the golden glow of candelabra, her figure becomes both spectacle and secret. You can almost feel the tension in the room. Ambassadors lean slightly forward, eager for their first glimpse. Nobles hush their conversations, waiting for the curtain to part on this girl who is more treaty than person. And then she arrives, each step measured, attendants subtly guiding her path. She is young, she is crowned with pearls, but the way her shoulders tilt, the way her head bends forward, betrays her. Whispers spread like smoke across the chamber. Here is your anchor of a fact. In early modern Europe, the debut of a princess at court was less about personality and more about inspection. Ambassadors filed secret reports on appearances, height, complexion, fertility prospects. Letters survive describing brides as pleasing enough, or lacking beauty but sufficient. Some reports are merciless, dissecting posture, skin, and health. For our hunchback queen, the unveiling was a trial by gaze, her body treated as an open dossier, and yet the quirky tidbit slips through. Veils were not uncommon in these ceremonies. Sometimes they were fashion, sheer and jewelled, meant to create mystery. Sometimes they were necessity, hiding smallpox scars or squints until the wedding was secured. In her case, the veil served both. Imagine her standing there, vision softened by gauze, knowing that for many she was beautiful only as long as the fabric blurred her. A veil, part ornament, part shield. Historians still argue whether her entrance was deliberately subdued to minimize attention, or whether it was standard pomp magnified in hindsight. Was she truly paraded in shadows, or did later storytellers drape her in gloom to match her bent spine? Scholars pore over dispatches and portraits, weighing exaggeration against truth. But enough letters survive that we sense the unease. She was noticed not for her presence, but for her absence of expected grace. Picture her moving down a long gallery. Chandeliers glitter, shoes click against marble. She walks between lines of courtiers whose eyes follow like hawks. Some bow too deeply to avoid staring directly. Others risk quick glances, cataloguing every irregularity. She feels their gaze. The veil does not protect her from that. Her hands tremble slightly, fingers clutching her gown. But her chin, her Habsburg chin, remains defiantly raised, the only part of her body trained to look unyielding. Here's where your gentle sarcasm creeps in. You think giving a presentation at school was nerve-wracking? Try walking into a room where your future husband, your in-laws, and half the political agents of Europe are silently grading your bone structure like it's an exam. Question 1. Does her spine curve too far? Question 2. Can she produce heirs with that frame? Question 3. How long before she collapses under the weight of that crown? And you thought forgetting your lines was bad. But it's not all cruelty. Some present pity, genuine or strategic. A few courtiers murmur admiration for her endurance. A court lady later wrote that though the Queen's figure was delicate and bent, her voice carried surprising strength when she spoke. That voice was her weapon, her way of claiming presence where her body faltered. Imagine her rehearsing in her chamber, repeating phrases until they rang clear. If she could not dazzle with posture, she would impress with words. Still, her entrance left its mark. Pamphlets soon carried gossip, caricatures exaggerating the hump, rumours of a cursed queen sent to doom her husband's line. Across borders, rival courts whispered gleefully, painting her as an omen. A bent queen, they said, meant a bent empire. Yet you picture her later that night, once the veils are removed and the torches extinguished. She sits before her mirror, attendants brushing her hair. The weight of jewels presses her scalp, but the weight of whispers presses harder. She asks softly, "Did they stare?" The maid hesitates, then replies, "Majesty, they admired your pearls." A half-truth, a kindness, a balm for a wound that never fully heals. The deeper cruelty is that she had no choice. Entrance was mandatory. Queens were not allowed to hide, no matter their shape. Her bent back was thrust into public light, draped in brocade, displayed as an extension of dynastic strategy. To be queen was to be both person and symbol, and for her the symbol was crooked before she ever held power. You may think your own entrance is awkward, walking into a crowded party, stumbling into a meeting late, but hers was magnified to empire scale, every step weighed in gold and blood. She entered not just a room, but history, under a shadow that would follow her forever. And as you lie here, drifting, you see her still in that hall, veiled, curved, stepping forward with stubborn dignity, her shadow bent across marble floors, her figure half hidden, half exposed, caught between majesty and mockery. You feel the chill sharpen now, as if the torches in the palace corridors flicker lower, while the stakes of her life rise higher. Childhood is gone. Veils and first entrances are behind her, and the machinery of empire creaks into motion. For queens in her dynasty, marriage was never about love. It was cartography with veils, treaties signed with rings. Every union mapped borders, secured alliances, or staved off war. And for her, whose body was already called misshapen, the irony was brutal. She was bent in bone, yet straightened into a pawn placed neatly on the board of European politics. You walk into a council chamber with her. The room smells of beeswax and ink, of tired men hunched over maps where rivers gleam in candlelight. They speak not of her laughter or her favourite song, but of her dowry, her lineage, her womb. To them she is both fortress and farmland, something to be given, something to be claimed. The treaties they draft will shape borders that peasants will bleed to defend. And yet the centrepiece of all this negotiation is a young woman whose back curves like a bow under her gown. Here's your anchor of fact. Dynastic marriages were the glue of Europe's political world from the Middle Ages into the early modern period. The Habsburgs especially perfected this game with the motto, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." Through carefully arranged unions, they built an empire spanning Spain, Austria, Burgundy, and the Low Countries. Rarely did daughters have any say. Brides were dispatched at 12, 13, 14, carried across mountains to lands they'd never seen, expected to merge their bodies with treaties signed by men decades older. The quirky tidbit, tucked like a note under a banquet plate, is that some of these royal betrothals were negotiated when the children were still in cradles. Imagine ambassadors kneeling over a sleeping infant whispering, "This one will belong to France," while the baby kicks, utterly unaware. In some cases, portraits of toddlers were sent across Europe as though they were swatches of fabric, inspected by future in-laws to confirm their suitability. You complain about bad Tinder photos? These were oil-painted, idealised, touched-up centuries before Photoshop, and the stakes were far more than dinner and a movie, and yet historians still argue about how much agency queens had in these arrangements. Some suggest that clever women found ways to manoeuvre, whispering to allies, shaping outcomes subtly. Others insist the machinery was too heavy, their lives too controlled, their wills smothered by dynastic necessity. Our hunchback queen may have had moments where she dreamed of saying no, but no written record suggests she was ever allowed to choose. She was a treaty in flesh, and treaties cannot protest. Picture her on the day the marriage contract is signed. She sits beside her father or regent, ink drying on parchment. The men debate the clauses, dowries measured in silver, fortresses promised as collateral, trade routes opened. She sits silently, her gown heavy with pearls. She does not speak. She is spoken for. Perhaps her back aches from the hours of stillness. Perhaps her fingers twitch to move, but she remains as still as marble. Her name is inked at the bottom of a page, sealing her future more securely than any vow she might utter later. Here's where your gentle sarcasm slips in like a whisper. You think it's rough when your parents arrange your extracurriculars without asking? Imagine them arranging your entire life, including whom you'll sleep beside, what language you'll speak, what country you'll never leave. At least when your mum signs you up for piano lessons, you can still quit. She couldn't exactly cancel a treaty by pretending to be sick on recital day. So she prepares. Portraits are painted to send ahead to her future husband's court. Artists smooth the curve of her back, soften the prominence of her jaw, brighten her complexion. The queen in the painting is almost a stranger, straight-backed, rosy, glowing with health. Ambassadors deliver the portrait with pride, extolling virtues that paint could not capture in flesh. And somewhere in a cold chamber, her future husband examines the canvas, nods, and signs his consent. The marriage is sealed not between two people, but between two shadows, a painted version of her and an imagined version of him. When the time comes to depart, the palace is alive with ceremony. Bells toll, cannons fire. Courtiers bow as she mounts the carriage. She is dressed magnificently, the curve of her back hidden beneath yards of brocade. Yet inside that carriage she grips her rosary, her stomach tight with dread. She's leaving behind familiar halls, nursemaids, even her language perhaps, all for a man she has never met. And all the while she knows he will see not the painted straight-backed queen, but the real one, hunched and trembling, stepping into his world like a shadow at noon. Imagine her arrival. Trumpets sound, the crowd cheers, banners wave. But as soon as she steps down, the whispers begin. She is smaller than expected. She walks stiffly. Her head tilts forward. The people watch, and their new queen is already the subject of rumour. Her husband, standing nearby, forces a smile. Behind his eyes flickers something colder, disappointment, calculation, maybe even resentment. For him too, the marriage is duty, and the body of the bride is part of the bargain. That is the cruelty of it. Marriage for her was never sanctuary, never partnership, never love. It was an extension of statecraft. Her bent back was not hidden in private chambers. It became part of foreign policy. If she bore heirs, the treaty was successful. If she failed, the alliance trembled. Imagine that weight pressing on her shoulders already bowed. You thought wedding day nerves were heavy? Hers carried the survival of nations, and still she endured. Her entrance into marriage was not filled with joy, but with obedience. She had no choice, but she stepped forward anyway, carrying treaties in her body, walking crooked into a destiny that demanded she stand tall. You follow her into the hush of married chambers, and the grandeur of palaces seems to fall strangely silent. Banquets, treaties, cannon fire. They fade once the doors close, and she is left with a man who is supposed to be her partner. Yet the air between them grows colder with each day. She enters their marriage already bent, already whispered about, already weighed down by the treaties that sealed them together. He enters it with his own burdens, expectation, politics, and perhaps, most corrosive of all, disdain. Imagine their first meeting. She has travelled days, perhaps weeks, across mountains and rivers, surrounded by guards, her gowns stiff with embroidery, her body aching from the journey. At the gates of her new home, trumpets sound. The court erupts in cheers. She steps forward, her back curved slightly despite every effort, her jaw set against the gaze of thousands. And there he is, her husband, the king, or prince, or archduke who will share her life. He bows, or perhaps only nods. Their eyes meet. But rather than warmth, there is a flicker of something else, something she feels deep in her stomach. Hesitation, calculation, distance. Here is your hard fact. Royal marriages were rarely affectionate partnerships. They were contracts of politics, with intimacy expected only as a duty to produce heirs. There are countless records of kings who spent more time with mistresses than with their wives. Some treated queens as ceremonial figures, useful for bearing children and appearing at festivals but irrelevant to their daily lives. For a queen already marked as misshapen, the likelihood of indifference was greater still. And now for the quirky tidbit. In some royal households, it was common to keep an elaborate marriage bed diary. Chamberlains or court officials actually recorded when the couple retired together, whether the union was completed, and sometimes even whether signs of fertility were observed. Imagine the lack of privacy, knowing that your intimacy, or lack thereof, was being scribbled down in neat Latin notes to be archived. In her case, the diary may have been thin, her husband reluctant to fulfill even the duty expected of him. Picture your modern social media relationship status, updated not by you but by a secretary with a feather quill. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. Historians still argue whether her husband avoided her out of cruelty, embarrassment or practicality. Some accounts suggest he dismissed her appearance as shameful, turning his eyes instead toward mistresses. Others hint that he simply found marriage a burden, disliking the political cage as much as she did. Still others speculate that he treated her politely but distantly, like a colleague rather than a partner. Whatever the reason, the pattern emerges. She was present, but not seen. Imagine her at supper with him. The long oak table stretches between them, gilded plates reflecting candlelight. She tries to meet his gaze, to share even the smallest word. But his eyes are on the food, or the courtiers, or the goblet in his hand. He asks after the horses, the harvest, the war. Never her health, never her pain. She sits silently, her hump pressing against the back of her chair, the pearls on her bodice digging into her skin. She eats carefully, her jaw straining with each bite, hoping he does not notice, yet fearing he already has. And here, your gentle sarcasm slips in like a wink. You've been ghosted on a text thread before. She was ghosted in person, across a dining table while an entire court watched. At least when your crush leaves you on read, you don't have 3 ambassadors scribbling notes about the awkward silence between you. For her, every cold glance was not only heartbreak, but political news to be dispatched across borders. The gossip spread quickly. Nobles whispered that the king did not care for his queen, that he found her body unappealing, that he turned elsewhere for affection. Satirical pamphlets emerged mocking their union, hinting that the bent queen could never produce straight heirs. Across Europe, rival courts delighted in the rumour. Here was a dynasty weakened not by swords, but by the distance between husband and wife, and still she endured. Nights in her chamber were the hardest. She waited for him, candles burning low, attendants whispering outside the door. Sometimes he came, out of duty. Sometimes he did not, and she lay alone, staring at the painted ceiling, listening to her own breathing echo in the vastness. Her hump pressed against the mattress, her jaw aching from clenching in silence. Did she pray for him to enter, or for him to stay away? History does not tell us. Yet not all was absence. There were moments, small, flickering moments, where duty forced closeness. Public festivals demanded they ride side by side, wave from balconies, walk in processions. She learned to smile beside him, though her lips never met comfortably. He learned to offer his arm, though his eyes wandered elsewhere. To the crowds they looked like a royal couple, glittering with jewels. To each other they were strangers chained together by treaties inked years before. The cruelty of his gaze, or his refusal to gaze, etched itself into her soul. To be ignored is one of the deepest wounds, especially when you are placed in the centre of attention only to be erased by the one person who should see you most clearly. She bore it, crooked and quiet, each slighter nail in the coffin of her private hopes. As you lie in bed now, safe from such scrutiny, you might sigh at your own romantic disappointments. But hers was a lifelong sentence. A husband who looked away was not just a private sorrow but a public humiliation, a political liability, a slow death of dignity. And so you drift deeper into her story, seeing her at court, at table, at festivals, always beside him, never truly with him. Her back curved, her head bowed, her heart bent under a weight far heavier than the hump on her shoulders. You drift further into the palace corridors, and the sound that follows you is not the ringing of bells or the shuffle of slippers against marble, it is the whisper. Whispers rise from behind tapestries, slip through carved wooden doors, ripple across banquet tables. For in her court silence was rare, gossip constant. A queen bent of back and jaw became a spectacle not only in portraits but in daily conversation. Her body was dissected by words long before physicians dared to touch her. You can almost hear it, the sharp hiss of silk skirts as ladies-in-waiting bend heads together, murmuring while pretending to adjust their embroidery. The low chuckle of courtiers at the far end of the hall, voices dropping as she passes. Ambassadors penning coded letters by candlelight, their quills scratching out lines like, "Her Majesty walks with heaviness, her figure curved, her face less pleasing than reported." Each word sealed in wax, sent across borders, carrying whispers like dandelion seeds blown into rival courts. Here is your solid fact. Court gossip was not idle chatter, it was political currency. Ambassadors were expected to report not only policies and treaties, but also the health, looks, and demeanour of queens and princesses. The Spanish and Austrian Habsburg courts in particular were notorious for their secret reports known as Relaciones de Estado. These documents were sometimes more concerned with whether a queen seemed fertile than with whether a general won a battle. Our hunchback queen was not simply mocked, she was catalogued, her bent body archived like a map of vulnerabilities. And now for the quirky tidbit. Courtiers often turned gossip into entertainment through masquerades and plays. In one French court masque, a character known as La Reine Courbée, the Crooked Queen, was portrayed by an actor in exaggerated hump and crooked gait, meant as satire. It was a parody not necessarily of her alone, but of the idea of dynastic weakness made flesh. Yet, imagine sitting in your palace, hearing news of another court staging your body as comedy. You worry about memes. She lived with entire pageants mocking her shape. Historians still argue whether her court itself was truly cruel, or whether exaggerations came more from abroad. Some accounts suggest her own ladies pitied her, treating her kindly despite whispers, while others insist the cruelty was internal as well. Snide remarks, half-hidden laughs, subtle exclusions from dances and hunts. Scholars sift through diaries, letters, and dispatches, debating how much venom filled her daily air. The truth may be both. Pity in private, mockery in public. Picture her at a banquet. The hall gleams with golden chandeliers, roasted pheasants line the tables, musicians play lively airs. She lifts her goblet with deliberate grace, her hand steady though her back protests under the weight of brocade. Across the hall, a group of courtiers lean together, whispering. They pretend to speak of wine, of harvests, but their eyes flick toward her again and again. She knows. Of course she knows. The music doesn't drown it out. Her ears catch the rhythm of laughter that follows her every movement, and here's where your gentle sarcasm sneaks in. You think high school hallways were toxic, with rumours about who kissed whom behind the bleachers? Try being a queen whose every cough, limp or crooked smile makes it into diplomatic dispatches read by kings 3 countries away. She didn't just have frenemies, she had rival dynasties weaponizing her posture. Gossip wasn't just petty, it was foreign policy. Yet she learned to navigate it. Some queens leaned into gossip, turning rumours into power. Did she too cultivate mystery? Did she wear heavier veils, play at silence, let whispers twist themselves into knots until no one knew what was true? Perhaps she even found a grim satisfaction. If they must talk, at least they could not ignore her. Better whispered than erased. Still, nights were cruel. In her private chamber, when the attendants finally left, she was left with silence, and silence amplifies every remembered whisper. She lay in bed, candles guttering low, the ache in her back refusing to ease. She replayed the glances, the chuckles, the rustle of silk as heads bent together. And perhaps she wondered if her shadow, the crooked silhouette cast against the wall by firelight, was truly herself, or merely the echo of their cruel words. What made it worse was the contradiction. She was mocked for her body, yet needed for her body. A queen was required to carry heirs, no matter how bent her spine, no matter how much her health faltered. Courtiers whispered she was unfit, and yet in the same breath demanded she produce children. Her hump was comedy in public, but her womb was state property. Imagine that double cruelty, to be told you're both monstrous and indispensable. And the whispering tongues stretched far beyond her court. In England, in France, in Italy, rival ambassadors repeated rumours of La Regina Gobba, the Hunchback Queen. Caricatures exaggerated her curve into a mountain, her jaw into a weapon. To enemies, she was proof that her dynasty had failed. To allies, she was a delicate figure to be defended. To herself, she was simply trapped. Her name carried on winds she could never control. But don't forget, there were those who defended her, who whispered differently. Some said her eyes were kind, her voice soft but commanding, her endurance remarkable. A few wrote that while her body was bent, her piety was upright. These whispers too circulated, though never as loudly as mockery. After all, cruelty always travels faster. You lie here now, eyelids heavy, and you realise how little has changed. Whispers still cut, whether in palaces or on screens. But imagine yours magnified 1,000-fold, turned into satire, encoded into state reports. She breathed gossip like air, never escaping it. She was a queen, yes, but also a prisoner of words that shaped her more cruelly than bone ever could. And so you see her, night after night, walking crooked through gleaming halls, her figure bent, her ears pricked to whispers that never ceased. A queen of pearls and brocade, yes, but also the queen of whispers, her crown forever tilted by tongues that would not fall silent. You drift now into the dressing chambers of the palace, where the air is heavy with incense and the rustle of fabrics. Here our queen is transformed daily, her bent frame swaddled in silk, her curved shoulders hidden beneath brocade, her crown adjusted by careful fingers until it seems, from a distance, to sit straight. Clothing was armour, jewels camouflage, crowns both symbol and disguise. Yet even layers of splendour could not fully erase the truth of her body. You picture her standing before a tall mirror framed in gilt, attendants bustling at her feet. One smooths the hem of her gown, another fastens pearls around her neck. A third tightens the stays of her corset, tugging until her breath comes short, until her spine protests, until the hump on her back is pressed as flat as possible. She winces, but she does not cry out. Queens are not permitted to feel pain. She raises her chin, her jaw jutting forward with Habsburg pride, and allows herself to be remade into spectacle. Here's your solid fact. Fashion in early modern Europe was not only about beauty, it was about politics. Wide skirts, elaborate sleeves, stiff bodices, all announced wealth, discipline and control. For queens, gowns were statements of dynasty. A heavily jewelled dress signalled prosperity, even if the treasury was empty. And in portraits, garments often disguised bodily flaws. Some painters used padded bodices, towering collars, or heavy mantles to redirect the gaze away from curved spines or narrow hips. Clothes, in this world, were not self-expression, but statecraft. And now the quirky tidbit, some gowns were so heavy they required pulley systems to lower them onto the wearer. Imagine standing still as attendants manoeuvre 30 or 40 pounds of fabric, literally lowering your identity onto you like armour. There are accounts of queens fainting from the weight, or needing special wheeled stools to support them during long ceremonies. If you think today's wedding dresses are suffocating, Imagine needing a team of engineers just to put on your Tuesday outfit. Historians still argue whether our Hunchback Queen's garments were deliberately designed to hide her curvature, or whether they were simply in line with fashion of the day. Some scholars suggest tailors worked overtime to create gowns with extra padding and layers that masked her hump. Others argue that no clothing could truly disguise her bent frame, and that portraits flattering her posture were more fantasy than fabric. The debate lingers as scholars squint at paintings searching for subtle slopes in shoulders, lines that betray truth beneath paint. But picture her, fully dressed, moving into the hall. The gown swishes like a tide, jewels flashing under candlelight. Courtiers bow, envoys record, and from a distance she looks every inch the queen. Only those close enough to see her shifting weight, her uneven shoulders, her careful steps, notice the strain beneath the splendour. For everyone else, silk and jewels create illusion. And here's where your gentle sarcasm slips in. You've fussed about uncomfortable clothes before. Itchy sweaters, shoes that pinch. She lived her life in outfits that doubled as scaffolding. Every banquet was a construction site, every ceremony an engineering challenge. Do I look good in this? Wasn't the question. It was. Does this fabric conceal the curve of my spine enough to prevent an international incident? Try worrying about that next time your jeans don't fit right. Yet even with silk and jewels, the whispers persisted. At court festivals, rivals glanced sidelong and muttered, "She bends beneath her crown." Satirists circulated sketches exaggerating her hump, jewels tumbling down her crooked shoulders. To some, the splendour only sharpened the contrast, like gilding a cracked statue. But to others, her endurance inspired awe. A queen who bore the weight of both gown and gossip, still standing, still ruling, still adorned in finery. In private, though, the cost was immense. After ceremonies, she returned to her chamber, attendants unfastening layers one by one. The corset unlaced, leaving red welts along her ribs. The jewelled collar removed, her neck sore from supporting it. The gown peeled away, her body bent and aching, the illusion crumbling. She sat in a linen shift, bare feet on cold stone, breathing deeply at last. For a moment, stripped of silk and jewels, she was simply herself. Curved, weary, human. But the crown never left her mind. Even when not on her head, it hovered above her like a shadow. To wear it was to prove her legitimacy. To bend beneath it was to risk mockery. That crooked crown became her symbol, tilted not by accident but by the very bones of her body. The contradiction is almost unbearable. Silk and jewels promised perfection. Her body defied it. The crown was designed to sit on straight spines. Hers bent. Yet somehow she carried it all. Clothing, jewels, whispers, politics. She became, in her crookedness, a new kind of symbol. Not the flawless ideal her dynasty wanted, but the flawed reality history remembers. And as you lie here, breathing slower now, you can almost see her in that mirror. A girl turned queen, draped in impossible finery, her shoulders uneven beneath velvet, her head bowed just enough for the crown to stay. Silk, jewels, and the crooked crown, a costume of majesty, a disguise of fragility, and the truest image of endurance you'll carry into sleep. You wander with her now into the chapel, where shadows stretch long across the marble floor, and incense curls upward in slow ribbons of smoke. The palace, with its whispers and finery, demands performance. But here, in the flickering half-light of candles, she turns her crooked body toward heaven, searching for something greater than politics or gossip, the possibility of a miracle. You hear the echo of the choir, voices rising into vaulted ceilings painted with saints in luminous colours. She kneels at the altar, though her spine protests, her shoulders uneven, her jaw clenched against pain. The rosary beads slip through her fingers, polished by use, warmed by her palms. For her, faith is not an ornament. It is a plea. She believes, or at least hopes, that the God who made mountains and seas might also straighten bones, ease breath, or soften the gaze of a husband who looks away. Here's your anchor of fact. Early modern queens were expected to embody piety as much as majesty. They acted as patrons of monasteries, funders of chapels, protectors of relics. Their faith was both personal solace and political display. Pilgrimages to shrines, donations to churches and public prayers were ways of proving both devotion and legitimacy. For a queen marked by deformity, religion also offered a narrative. If her body was bent, perhaps her soul could be straightened by faith. And the quirky tidbit, relics were everywhere, and some of the most unusual were thought to heal deformities. One relic venerated in Spain was a piece of the Virgin Mary's veil, believed to soothe ailments of women. In Austria, pilgrims sought the bones of St. Radegun to ease crooked spines. There were even rumours that fragments of saints' ribs could transfer strength into the weak. Our queen may have pressed her hump against reliquaries, hoping that the holiness of bone might seep into her own. Imagine the quiet desperation of leaning your back against a jewelled casket, whispering for the saint within to make you straight. Historians still argue whether such acts were expressions of genuine faith or carefully staged spectacles to rally sympathy. Some claim queens like her believed with childlike hope in divine intervention. Others argue they used pilgrimages strategically, transforming personal weakness into public sanctity. For her, perhaps it was both, private longing wrapped in public ritual. She prayed because she needed to, but she also prayed because the court demanded the sight of their queen humbled before God. Picture her walking, slowly, painfully, into a shrine. The air smells of wax and myrrh, pilgrims pressing close, murmuring prayers of their own. She moves forward, attendants steadying her, and kneels on cold stone. The people gasp softly. Even bent as she is, she looks holy in that moment, a queen humbling herself before heaven. Some whisper that her hump itself is a mark of sainthood, a cross she bears for the sins of her dynasty. Others whisper the opposite, that it is God's punishment. She closes her eyes and shuts them out. Here's where your gentle sarcasm slips in. You think your prayers about finding lost keys or passing exams are desperate. She was bargaining with heaven for a straight spine and heirs for an empire. The stakes were a little higher than your parking ticket. And yet, she prayed with the same human voice, the same hope that someone up there was listening. In her private chamber, faith was quieter but no less urgent. She kept icons by her bed, small painted panels of saints, their golden halos gleaming in candlelight. She kissed them before sleep, whispered prayers into linen pillows. Perhaps she dreamed of miracles, rising from bed in the morning with her back suddenly straight, her husband's gaze suddenly soft, her name freed from mockery. Each morning she awoke the same, the ache still there, but she prayed again, refusing to surrender the hope. Her piety became her armour. When courtiers whispered, she clutched her rosary. When her husband looked away, she turned her eyes upward. When her body failed her, she reminded herself that saints had suffered worse. She leaned into the idea that crookedness could be holy, that endurance could itself be a miracle, and sometimes faith gave her unexpected power. Pilgrims who saw her pray wept, touched by her humility. Priests praised her as an example of patience. For a moment her bent body became less mockery than symbol, a queen who bore pain with dignity. In a world obsessed with perfection, her imperfection turned her into a mirror for others' suffering. Perhaps that was her quiet victory. To turn her deformity into a testimony that reached farther than jewels or crowns. But the silence after prayer was heavy. Heaven did not answer in thunderbolts or sudden healing. She carried her hump day after day, the same curve shadowing her figure, and yet she never stopped hoping. That was her miracle, not that she was healed, but that she believed she still might be. As you lie in your bed now, listening to the hum of night, you might wonder what you would pray for if placed in her shoes. A straighter back, a softer gaze from those around you, or simply the strength to endure another day without breaking. She asked for all of these, and though the saints never bent her bones into straightness, they gave her something else, the endurance to keep walking, to keep kneeling, to keep being queen despite the whispers. And so you see her now, bathed in candlelight, her crooked crown tilted as she bows before relics, pearls glinting against her gown, lips whispering prayers no chronicler recorded. Faith in saints and miracles was her secret lantern in a dark hall of mockery, and she carried it until her final breath. The palace grows colder as you follow her further into the heart of her reign, and the whispers that once mocked her shape now take on another tone. Expectation. Queens were not only symbols of beauty and faith, they were dynastic vessels. A treaty sealed in silk and ink was meaningless without children to inherit it. Heirs were the real signatures, scribbled not with quill but with womb. And in a court that measured everything in bloodlines, her bent back was weighed against her ability to carry the future of an empire. You can almost hear the conversations behind closed doors. Grey-bearded ministers lean over maps, their fingers tracing borders. If she produces a son, one murmurs, this alliance holds. Another shakes his head, but look at her, frail, crooked. How can she endure childbirth? They speak as if she were a horse to be inspected for breeding, her humanity lost in calculations of blood and soil. Here is your historical fact to anchor in the candlelight. Fertility was not a private matter in royal courts. It was public business, dissected by ambassadors and recorded in official reports. Queens were monitored for signs of pregnancy as closely as soldiers were monitored for signs of desertion. A late period, a swollen belly, even a faint bout of nausea, all were noted and whispered across Europe within days. The fate of wars hinged on such symptoms. For a queen with fragile health and a curved spine, these expectations were crushing. And here is the quirky tidbit. When a queen gave birth, it was often witnessed by an audience. In France, dozens of courtiers and officials were allowed into the chamber to ensure the child was legitimate. Imagine labouring under the eyes of nobles scribbling notes, some perched on stools, others craning necks, all waiting to see the child crown while the mother struggled for breath. Privacy was not an option. It was theatre, and the Queen's body was both stage and actor. Historians still argue whether our Hunchback Queen's frailty truly limited her ability to conceive, or whether hostile accounts exaggerated her struggles. Some reports suggest she miscarried often. Others claim she never carried to term at all. Scholars pore over medical descriptions, debating whether scoliosis or kyphosis would have hindered her hips in childbirth. The truth may lie somewhere between biology and rumour, with her body's challenges magnified by the court's relentless scrutiny. Picture her in her private chamber, attendants hovering. She feels unwell, a queasiness that could mean pregnancy, or merely an illness from the endless feasts. Immediately whispers ripple through the court. She is with child. Candles are lit in chapels, bells prepared to toll. When days pass and the sickness fades, the rumour collapses into silence, replaced by pitying glances and quiet mockery. Every month became a cycle of hope and humiliation, and here your gentle sarcasm slips in like a nudge. You thought your relatives asking, "When will you settle down and have kids?" At family gatherings was bad. Try an entire continent asking, complete with ambassadors filing reports, priests praying publicly, and rival dynasties betting treaties on your uterus. Suddenly Aunt Linda's nosy questions don't seem so intrusive. Her husband's coldness deepened the weight. If he rarely visited her chamber, how could heirs come? Some ambassadors whispered that his disdain was an excuse, that he never tried. Others insisted he did, reluctantly, but without success. Either way, her body bore the blame. In a world where queens were measured by children, she was measured and found wanting. The rituals multiplied. Physicians prescribed broths made of crushed pearls and herbs, promising fertility. Priests pressed relics to her belly, invoking saints who had aided barren women. Astrologers studied the stars, declaring auspicious nights for conception. All of it circled back to her, a woman already bent beneath a crooked spine, now bent beneath expectations that no miracle seemed to answer. And yet, she endured the theatre. She rode beside her husband at festivals, smiling stiffly as crowds cheered. She stood in chapels while candles burned for unborn heirs. She accepted the prayers, the remedies, the endless scrutiny, even as her body ached under the weight of failure. She knew what they said, that her womb was as bent as her back, that her dynasty would collapse through her crookedness. And still she carried herself forward, pearls glinting against velvet, jaw set in defiance. You picture her in a moment of solitude. She kneels by her bedside, hands clasped, whispering not for saints to heal her back this time, but for strength to bear a child. Her hump presses against her nightgown, her body trembling. She promises silently that she would endure any pain, any risk, if only she could silence the whispers with a child's cry. But the night remains still. That is the cruelest truth. When power needed a body, hers was never enough for them. Bent though she was, she lived each day as if she could meet their impossible demands, bearing weight no straight-backed queen could have carried with such endurance. And as you lie here, heavy-lidded, you realise the symmetry. Her back bent under bone, her spirit bent under duty, yet she remained unbroken. For power demanded heirs, and though she could not give them, she gave something else. Resilience, the stubborn defiance of living as queen even when her body was deemed unfit. You step now into the darker chambers of her life, where the smell of incense gives way to the sharper odours of ointments, poultices and bitter draughts. For when whispers of her fragility grew too loud, physicians and midwives were summoned, each offering some new remedy to correct what nature had bent. Her bent spine, her frail body, her struggles with fertility, all became medical problems to be solved, often with methods that inflicted more pain than relief. You imagine her sitting stiffly in a high-backed chair, the court physician hovering with solemn face. He traces his fingers along her back, murmuring in Latin, noting the curve. He prescribes a rigid brace of whalebone and iron to be worn beneath her gown. The attendants tighten the straps until she gasps, her ribs squeezed, her skin bruised. He assures her this will straighten her posture, though she can barely breathe. Later that night, alone in her chamber, she removes the brace and finds welts pressed into her flesh like cruel signatures. Here's your hard fact. Early modern medicine for spinal deformities relied on brutal devices. Braces of iron, weighted harnesses, even stretching racks were used in attempts to correct curvature. None were effective. Most inflicted lasting harm. In France, Ambroise Paré, the famous surgeon, designed corsets reinforced with metal plates to force posture. In Spain, similar contraptions were prescribed to noble children. They were heavy, hot, suffocating, and entirely futile. Our queen endured these in the hope of appearing less bent, less mocked, less dismissed. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some remedies were stranger still. Midwives recommended powdered gemstones, diamonds, emeralds, even sapphires, ground into drinks as cures for weakness. Others swore by drinking water in which gold coins had been boiled, claiming the metal's virtue transferred to the body. Imagine sipping your jewellery box for breakfast, convinced it might straighten your back or strengthen your womb. You thought kale smoothies were weird? She was choking down liquefied bling. Historians still argue whether her treatments were sincere attempts at care or thinly veiled cruelties, meant to display diligence while knowing they would fail. Some suggest physicians exaggerated her condition to enhance their own prestige. The more complex the patient, the greater the honour in treating her. Others argue she may have believed fully in these remedies, clinging to any hope that promised relief. We cannot know whether she recognised the futility, or whether hope blinded her to the pain. Picture her in childbirth, one of those nights when power demanded a body and hers was forced to comply. The chamber is crowded, midwives bustling, physicians commanding, candles sputtering in the heat. She grips the sheets, her back spasming with pain. Remedies have been administered, broths, herbs, relics pressed to her belly. Still, the agony is unbearable. Hours pass, whispers grow. She is too weak. Sweat pours down her face, her hair clings in damp strands. At last, the child is delivered, or perhaps lost, and she lies broken on the bed, her body more bent than before, while the court waits outside to hear whether the treaty of flesh has succeeded or failed. And here your gentle sarcasm cuts softly. You complain when the doctor prescribes bitter cough syrup, or when the dentist pokes too hard with a drill. She endured iron corsets, gemstone potions, and childbirth turned into public theatre, all while nobles took notes on whether she looked vigorous enough. Compared to her, your annual checkup feels like a spa day. In her quieter moments, remedies took a different form. Midwives massaged her back with oils, hoping to loosen muscles locked by curvature. Herbalists burned sage, whispered charms, traced crosses on her skin. Some remedies comforted her simply because they were gentle, even if useless. The warmth of hands on her back may have soothed more than the iron corsets ever could. For all the cruelty of medicine, there were moments of kindness too, soft voices promising, "This will ease you," even if it did not. Yet the remedies never changed the outcome. Her back remained bent, her body frail, her fertility uncertain. Each failed attempt was followed by new prescriptions, harsher devices, stranger concoctions. She endured them because she had no choice. To refuse treatment would be to admit weakness. To accept was to suffer. Either way, her body remained the battlefield where politics, superstition and science clashed. You picture her years later looking at the pile of devices, bottles and relics in her chamber. Corsets lined with iron, vials of powdered pearls, jars of strange herbs. Perhaps she smiled bitterly, realizing she had swallowed half the kingdom's treasury without ever gaining the health it promised. Or perhaps she prayed still, convinced that one more relic, one more potion, might finally deliver the miracle she longed for. That is her tragedy. To be treated not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a body to be fixed. Doctors, midwives, and remedies surrounded her, but none could straighten what generations of dynasty had bent. And still she endured. Each cruel device removed, each bitter potion drained, each failed promise survived. She bore not just her hump, but the weight of all their false cures, walking forward under burdens no straight-backed queen would ever know. And as you settle deeper into your blankets, you can almost hear the clink of bottles, the scrape of iron braces, the murmur of midwives around her bed. Doctors, midwives, and cruel remedies formed the chorus of her life, a chorus that never stopped singing, even as her body bent further beneath its song. You drift now into galleries heavy with oil and varnish, where silence smells faintly of turpentine and candle smoke. The queen no longer stands only in the flesh. She lives on canvas, multiplied and distributed, her likeness carried across Europe to courts that will never see her bent body in person. But these are not honest mirrors. They are careful illusions, crafted by painters whose livelihoods depended on pleasing monarchs. In paint, her shoulders straighten, her hump dissolves, her jaw softens, her cheeks bloom with health. The queen among portraits is not the queen who struggles to rise from her bed. Picture the scene, an artist kneeling before his easel, brushes lined like soldiers. The queen sits stiffly, her corset biting, her jewels heavy. He studies her closely but with an understanding glance. They both know the rules of this performance. He paints her eyes a little brighter, her lips a little fuller, her posture a little straighter. Hours pass, and when the canvas is unveiled, courtiers exclaim, "Majestic! Radiant!" The queen forces a smile. She sees herself there, and yet not herself. Here is your grounding fact. Portraiture was propaganda. Queen's images were not only personal but political. They were sent abroad to cement betrothals, displayed in courts to awe ambassadors, and hung in chapels to sanctify dynasties. Painters were instructed, sometimes explicitly, sometimes by silent pressure, to flatter. Evidence survives in letters. Monarchs complained when likenesses were too plain, ordering retouches before the canvas was allowed to travel. For a queen with deformities, portraiture became both salvation and prison. And the quirky tidbit? Some royal portraits were deliberately altered mid-journey. Couriers carried canvases across mountain passes, and in a few documented cases local painters were instructed to improve them before delivery. Imagine a 16th century Photoshop session in a tavern workshop, chin softened here, spine straightened there, before the portrait was repackaged for an awaiting groom. It was catfishing by oil paint, and it shaped marriages as surely as treaties did. Historians still argue whether the surviving portraits of our Hunchback Queen reflect truth or invention. Some show her stiff but upright, with only the faintest tilt of the shoulders. Others seem to hide her body almost entirely behind curtains, jewels, or vast collars. Scholars pore over brushstrokes, debating whether the shadows conceal a curve, or whether later gossip painted deformities harsher than reality. The portraits whisper ambiguity. Was she as bent as the rumours claimed? Or did her image blur somewhere between reality and propaganda? Imagine standing in one of those echoing galleries. Golden frames gleam, pearls painted so vividly they seem to glisten, velvet so richly textured you can almost hear it rustle. And in each painting, the queen gazes outward, calm, composed, eternally youthful. She looks like every other queen before her, majestic, untouchable. Only you, walking with the weight of her story, know the dissonance. Behind that serene face is a body aching under corsets, a woman mocked by whispers, a spine that will not straighten. And here's where your gentle sarcasm slips in. You thought your awkward selfies didn't capture the real you. She lived an entire lifetime in which the world only saw the filtered version, while the raw image was hidden behind heavy curtains. At least your bad photos don't get shipped to foreign kings and enshrined in museums. She was the original victim of editing software, except the tool was a paintbrush dipped in costly pigment. The portraits became double-edged swords. Abroad, they elevated her. She was beautiful enough, radiant enough, queen enough to maintain alliances. At home, they created a cruel contrast. Anyone who saw her in person knew the truth. Behind her back, courtiers muttered, "The canvas lies." The more the portraits flattered her, the sharper the whispers grew. A queen among portraits was perfect. The queen in flesh was not. Yet perhaps she found comfort in them too. On lonely nights she might gaze at her own painted likeness and imagine that woman existed. That somewhere, in pigment and varnish, she was straight-backed, elegant, untouchable. Perhaps she even envied her painted twin, wondering what it felt like to move without pain, to smile without mockery. For her, the portrait was not only propaganda but also a fantasy, a reflection of who she wished she could be. Courtiers used portraits as currency. When ambassadors from rival courts visited, they were shown her painted image in galleries, the hump erased, the body idealized. Negotiations unfolded under her painted gaze, the queen in oil silently lending legitimacy to treaties she would never sign herself. Her painted self travelled farther than she ever did, reaching corners of Europe she would never see. To distant princes she was the canvas, not the woman. The irony is unbearable. The queen among portraits was eternal, unbent, radiant. The queen in her chamber was crooked, aching, mortal. History preserved the illusion more faithfully than the truth. Even now, when scholars study her legacy, they debate not just her actions, but whether her face on canvas tells lies or half-truths. And so you see her, standing in the gallery alone after courtiers have left. She gazes at her painted self, tilts her crooked shoulders forward, and whispers to the canvas, "At least one of us is beautiful." Then she turns, her shadow bending across the polished floor, leaving the portrait to gleam silently in golden stillness. You follow her story now beyond the palace gates, across mountains and rivers, carried not by horses or ships, but by words. For rumours travel faster than armies, and in early modern Europe they were as potent as gunpowder. Pamphlets, letters, and idle talk in marketplaces carried her crooked image into the minds of strangers who would never set eyes upon her. The queen's bent spine, her uneven shoulders, her frail frame, these became emblems wielded by rival dynasties, painted as metaphors for weakness. Her body was not hers anymore. It belonged to Europe's rumour mill. Picture a candlelit study in Paris. An ambassador sharpens his quill, glances around to be sure the servants are out of earshot, then begins to write. His letter will cross the Alps, stuffed into a courier's satchel, reporting not on armies or treaties, but on her figure. The queen bends heavily as she walks, her face pale, her jaw pronounced. It is doubtful she may long endure. By the time the words reach Vienna, they are copied, embellished, repeated in whispers over wine. What began as observation becomes prophecy. Her hump is not just a curve of bone, it is a sign of dynastic collapse. Here is your hard fact. The diplomatic networks of Europe thrived on gossip. The Venetian ambassadors, known for their detailed relazioni, left thousands of pages describing the appearance and health of foreign rulers. These reports circulated back home, shaping policy. In many cases, the fertility or deformity of a queen influenced whether states expected alliances to hold. One crooked back could ripple outward into wars and treaties. And now the quirky tidbit. Pamphleteers often disguised political satire as street entertainment. In the Low Countries, woodcut prints were sold showing grotesque caricatures of rival monarchs. Bent backs, swollen jaws, drooping eyes, features exaggerated until rulers looked monstrous. People bought them as jokes, pasted them in taverns, laughed over ale. It was the 16th century version of a political cartoon shared on social media. Imagine seeing your own body, your spine, your face, sold for a penny on a street corner in Antwerp, strangers laughing at your hump while drinking spiced beer. Historians still argue whether her reputation abroad was worse than at home. Some scholars say foreign rivals deliberately exaggerated her deformity to mock her dynasty. Others believe the whispers within her own court fueled the fire, feeding caricatures that raced across borders. What is certain is that her image was never contained. Even in lands she would never visit, she became known not as a queen by name, but as the Hunchback. Imagine her hearing fragments of these rumours. A visiting ambassador bows stiffly, his eyes betraying curiosity. Later she overhears a courtier mutter about a pamphlet from France. She asks softly, "What does it say of me?" The lady-in-waiting hesitates, then lies, "Only that you are devout." But the queen knows. The lies taste like ash. She feels the rumour like a dagger sliding in silently. Wounds that leave no scar on the body but bleed within the soul. And here your gentle sarcasm enters, a tired smile in the dark. You've worried about your reputation spreading through gossip at school or work. She lived in a world where her bent spine was discussed in city squares she never stepped foot in, analysed by men she never met, mocked in languages she did not speak. Imagine being roasted internationally without a chance to clap back. At least you can delete a bad post. She couldn't delete a pamphlet nailed to a tavern wall. Rumours across borders carried consequences beyond mockery. They shaped alliances. Princes who might have considered her daughters for marriage hesitated, fearing the inheritance of her crookedness. Military leaders doubted the strength of treaties sealed by her fragile body. Even priests used her figure in sermons as examples of sin's corruption of flesh. A bent queen became a bent parable, yet rumours also transformed her into a symbol of resilience. In some circles, her endurance, despite frailty, was admired. She bears what God gave her, one ambassador admitted grudgingly, with remarkable dignity. Some even whispered that her bent body mirrored Christ's own suffering, that in her pain she reflected holiness. Thus, across borders, she was both monster and saint, mocked and exalted, cursed and sanctified. Picture her alone at night, a letter from a foreign ambassador resting unopened on her desk. She knows what it contains, another assessment of her womb, her spine, her worth. She closes her eyes, refusing to break the seal. Instead, she lights a candle, holds her rosary, and whispers prayers not for straightness, but for silence. Just one night without rumours carried on the wind. But silence never came. The next morning, the letters were already copied, the caricatures already printed, the whispers already sailing across the sea. She remained queen in her chamber, but abroad she was a legend of crookedness, a metaphor wielded like a sword by those who wanted her dynasty to fall. And so you see her legacy not only in palaces but in pamphlets, not only in portraits but in rumours. Her bent body became the gossip of Europe, a symbol twisted and reshaped to fit whatever narrative her enemies desired. Rumours across borders carried her farther than armies ever could, until her name was less remembered than her shape. As you sink deeper into the quiet of your room, you realise this truth. Words can cross mountains faster than troops, and whispers can outlive crowns. She learned that lesson too well, her crooked shadow cast in every corner of Europe where someone muttered, laughed, or prayed at the mention of the Hunchback Queen. The palace feels heavier now, as though the stone itself is sagging under centuries of repetition. You sense it in every corridor, every chapel, every echoing hall. The dynasty is fraying. Once their motto was confidence. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. But those marriages, those endless loops of cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, have produced not strength but weakness. The line buckles, and your hunchback queen becomes its living emblem. Picture her seated in council, her crown gleaming though it pinches her temples. Ministers shuffle nervously around her, documents spread across oak tables. They speak of wars bleeding the treasury dry, of peasants restless, of rival dynasties pressing at the borders. But beneath it all hums a deeper anxiety, her body. Will she produce heirs? Produce. Can she outlive her ailments? The dynasty's survival is tied not to armies or gold, but to the fragile bent frame of the woman sitting quietly at the head of the chamber. Here's your grounding fact. Dynastic decline was not just metaphorical. By the late 17th century, the Spanish Habsburgs, consumed by inbreeding, were running out of viable heirs. Charles II, last of his line, was famously incapacitated, his health so poor that he could not produce children. The result was the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that tore Europe apart. Our queen belonged to this same genetic spiral. Every curved spine and every weak jaw symbolised the line's decay. Now for the quirky tidbit. So obsessed were these dynasties with maintaining purity that they sometimes traced their own bloodlines back to mythical origins. Romans, Trojans, even Adam himself, claiming divine sanction for their family tree. One Spanish king insisted his blood was so ancient and pure that it could not be mixed with lesser houses. The irony, of course, is that the pursuit of purity bred weakness. Imagine branding your family as descended from Hercules, only to collapse from scoliosis before 30. Historians still argue about how much contemporaries recognise the dynasty's fragility. Some claim ministers knew full well that inbreeding was destroying the line but dared not admit it aloud. Others suggest superstition blinded them, convincing courts that God would protect his chosen rulers regardless of biology. The truth is probably both. Whispers of doom passed among servants and foreign envoys, while officials clung desperately to ceremony, crowns and prayers. For the Queen, the failing line was not abstract. It was her daily reality. Every miscarriage, every illness, every fainting spell fed the narrative that her body mirrored the collapse of her house. Rivals abroad called her a crooked branch on a dying tree. Courtiers at home sighed behind fans, wondering whether God had cursed them. She lived not as a woman, but as an omen. Imagine her at Mass, kneeling before the altar. The priest prays for the dynasty's longevity. The choir sings of God's favour. She bows her head, but she feels the weight pressing harder. Her back curves beneath the heavy gown. Her rosary beads slip through trembling fingers. The hymn swells, but in her mind it sounds like a dirge, not for her soul, but for her line. Here's where your gentle sarcasm creeps in. You think family pressure is bad when your relatives ask why you're not more successful? She had an entire continent watching, measuring whether her crooked shoulders could hold up the future of empires. Forget your mom comparing you to your cousin who became a doctor. She had ambassadors comparing her womb to entire armies. That's the kind of pressure you can't laugh off with a holiday glass of wine. The failing line became visible in other ways too. The treasury strained under the cost of endless wars, while crops failed in parts of the realm. Peasants grumbled that their rulers lived in silk while their bellies were empty. Nobles jostled for influence, sensing weakness at the top, and all the while caricatures of the queen spread abroad, mocking her body as shorthand for dynastic collapse. Her hump was not just her burden, it was a metaphor wielded by enemies to predict the end of her family's reign. She felt it. In the long nights, when her attendants had left and only candles burned low, she must have sensed the silence pressing in. The portraits of her ancestors stared down from the walls. Charles V, Philip II, Maria Anna. Their eyes seemed to accuse her, their jaws jutting defiantly, their spines straight in oil paint. She could not measure up. She was bent, frail, childless, or nearly so, and yet she was the one left to bear the dynasty's fate. Picture her walking through palace gardens, the flowers blooming in symmetrical rows. From a distance she looks regal, her gown trailing along gravel paths. Up close, you see the tremor in her steps, the way she leans on her attendant's arm, the crown of pearls weighing down her bowed head. The garden itself becomes metaphor, carefully arranged, outwardly beautiful but fragile, dependent on constant tending. Like the dynasty, it is a cultivated illusion, always on the verge of wilting. The weight of a failing line is heavier than iron corsets or jewelled crowns. It is the weight of history pressing downward, the sense that your body is the hinge upon which empires swing. She bore it every day, crooked, aching, yet still dressed in splendour, still carrying the illusion of stability. And as you lie here in the stillness of your room, you realise what she must have known. Sometimes dynasties collapse not with swords, but with sighs, not in fire but in whispers. The Hunchback Queen carried those sighs in her bent frame, her body the living prophecy of a line destined to crumble. The corridors grow quieter now, their echoes fading into dusk. You sense it. Her life is reaching its close, and the whispers that once mocked her bend now murmur of mortality. She's not old, not by the measure of peasants who toil in fields and survive into grey years by sheer endurance. But her body, long burdened, cannot sustain her much longer. Every step costs more, every breath feels heavier, every glance in the mirror shows a woman hollowed by pain. The dynasty that pressed its crown upon her head has taken everything from her body, and soon it will take her life. You picture her chambers, the air thick with smoke from beeswax candles, curtains drawn to dim the sun, attendants pacing quietly with bowls of broth she cannot swallow. The queen lies reclined, her hump pressing painfully against pillows that cannot soften its weight. Her rosary rests on her chest, rising and falling with shallow breaths. Around her, courtiers whisper not prayers but calculations. Who will inherit? Who will maneuver? Who will take advantage of her absence? Here's your hard fact. Early modern queens often died young. The toll of childbirth, repeated miscarriages, fragile health, and relentless duty cut short lives that began already frail. Records are littered with queens dead in their 20s or 30s, bodies broken by expectations they could never refuse. Our Hunchback queen belonged to this pattern. Her bent spine, her illnesses, her failures to produce heirs, each hastened her decline, each made her a vessel emptied too soon. And here is the strange, almost absurd tidbit. Sometimes royal corpses were subjected to public autopsies, their entrails preserved in ornate jars, their bones displayed as relics of dynastic sanctity. One Austrian archduchess had her heart interred in a silver casket separate from her body, carried to a convent as if holiness resided in that single organ. Imagine the irony. In life her body was mocked, dissected by whispers, prodded by physicians. In death it was literally dissected, turned into a collection of curiosities. Historians still argue whether her decline was swift or lingering. Some accounts suggest she wasted away quietly, fading into frailty with little spectacle. Others claim her deathbed was surrounded by drama, husband absent or indifferent, priests circling like carrion birds, courtiers already jostling for power. The uncertainty reflects her life itself, truth and rumour entwined, her story blurred by politics until no detail can be trusted entirely. Picture her final hours. The chamber is thick with the smell of incense. A priest leans close, murmuring the last rites. She clutches her rosary, lips moving in whispered prayer. Perhaps she asks for healing, though she knows it will not come. Perhaps she asks for forgiveness, though her only sin was being born bent. Perhaps she asks for peace, though the whispers of the court outside deny her even that. Her husband does not look at her. He may be in another chamber, already distracted by state business or another woman, or perhaps he stands at the foot of her bed, eyes distant, waiting for the inevitable. Either way, the silence between them remains, cold, unbroken, the final echo of a marriage built on treaties, not tenderness. And here your gentle sarcasm slips in like a bitter sigh. You think dying alone in a hospital room sounds terrifying. She managed to die surrounded by people and still alone, priests chanting, attendants fussing, courtiers calculating, and yet not one truly saw her. Not the bent girl, not the weary queen, not the human behind the crown. She left the world as she lived in it, visible to everyone, invisible to all. When the final breath leaves her, the court erupts, not in grief, but in protocol. Bells toll across the city, cannons fire, heralds ride into the streets announcing the Queen's death. The people weep, though many never knew her beyond caricature. Abroad, letters are dispatched, some expressing condolence, others smugly noting that the dynasty has lost another crooked branch. Her body, meanwhile, is prepared for burial. Attendants wash it, dress it in silk one last time, lay it beneath a crown she no longer feels. The funeral is splendid, of course. Coffins for queens always are. Incense fills the cathedral, choirs sing, nobles parade in black velvet. Yet behind the solemnity lies unease. Everyone knows her death has not redeemed the dynasty. No miracle child came, no sudden strength arose. She has gone to her grave as she lived, bent, pitied, mocked, and used. Her body lies straight now, only because death has stiffened what life had curved. But what lingers is the symbolism. Rivals abroad gloat. The Hunchback Queen's death proves divine punishment. Courtiers at home sigh in resignation. Another chapter closed in a failing line. Historians centuries later will debate whether her deformities were as grotesque as described, or whether rumour exaggerated her into a monster. But the tragedy remains. Her humanity was lost in life, and in death it is buried beneath metaphor. As you lie in bed now, eyelids heavy, you can almost hear the muffled toll of funeral bells. Imagine her coffin, draped in velvet, carried through candlelit streets. Imagine the crown resting crooked on its lid, as though mocking her one final time. Death gave her no redemption, only silence. Yet perhaps in that silence she finally found what life denied her. A moment free from whispers, free from corsets, free from expectation. And so the Hunchback Queen passes into history. Not as a saint, not as a monster, but as a woman whose bent body bore the unbearable weight of empire until it could bear no more. The candles are long since guttered out. The bells that tolled for her have rusted silent, and yet her shadow stretches into the present. You live centuries after her death, but still her crooked back lingers in textbooks, in museum galleries, in genetic studies whispered about in lecture halls. She is gone, yet not gone. Bent bones may rest in the earth, but the story of her body continues to ripple through history like a distorted reflection on water. Imagine walking into a museum today. The glass cases gleam with portraits. Women in brocade, men with sceptres, dynasties immortalised in oil. And among them is her, painted straight, luminous, crowned. The plaque on the wall tells you her name, her lineage, her political significance. But the audio guide whispers another truth. She was bent, she was mocked, she was remembered not for treaties signed or festivals held, but for her spine curving like a bow. Visitors nod, murmur, move on to the next exhibit, and the Hunchback Queen becomes a footnote. Yet even as they leave, her bent shadow follows. Here's your solid fact to hold. Modern geneticists have studied the Habsburgs, combing through portraits, letters and family trees. A 2019 study confirmed what rumour long suggested. The Habsburg jaw was indeed a product of repeated consanguineous marriages. Genetic bottlenecks weakened immune systems, increased deformities, and doomed the line. Historians and scientists together stitched together the evidence. The dynasty fell not only from war but from biology itself. Our queen's body was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern written into DNA. And here's the quirky tidbit. In the 21st century, her image has made its way into unexpected places. Memes, blogs, even fashion commentary. Some students, scrolling late at night, laugh at woodcuts of her caricatures, turning her hump into a joke divorced from its pain. Others reclaim her as a symbol of endurance, writing think pieces that call her the queen who bore history's weight. She has become, bizarrely, a cultural echo, distorted and reused in ways she never could have imagined. Historians still argue whether we should pity her, admire her, or analyse her without emotion. Was she a victim of dynastic cruelty, or a participant in it by virtue of her role? Did she believe herself cursed, or did she carry her deformities with quiet pride? The debate continues, scholars circling her memory like moths around a flame that flickers, but never dies. The truth is elusive, buried beneath propaganda, portraits and rumour, but the fact that we are still talking about her proves she has not been erased. Picture her shadow falling across your own room tonight. The fan hums softly. The glow of your phone screen lights your blanket, but in the corner of your eye you see her, a woman bent but crowned, pearls glinting against a curved spine. She looks at you across centuries and you realise she's not just history. She's a reminder of how power warps flesh, how obsession warps families, how gossip warps memory. Her crookedness is not hers alone. It is ours too, inherited in the way we still measure bodies, still whisper about appearances, still forget the humanity behind the spectacle. Here's where your gentle sarcasm sighs in. You thought cancel culture was rough. She was cancelled for life by pamphlets and caricatures that outlived her. No apology tour, no rebranding campaign, no redemption arc on social media. Just centuries of whispers repeating the same cruel nickname, Hunchback. And still she endures, her story retold tonight in your ear. The echo of her life lingers in modern medicine as well. Doctors studying scoliosis, kyphosis, genetic disorders. They trace her case as one of history's most infamous examples. Her body has become data, a cautionary tale in textbooks. Students sketch spines, chart pedigrees, run calculations on inbreeding coefficients. She, who once prayed in chapels for a miracle, is now analysed in laboratories under fluorescent lights. In a way, she finally received what her court never gave her, an explanation rooted not in superstition but in science. Yet even science cannot strip away the sorrow. For beyond the genetics, beyond the caricatures, beyond the portraits, she was still a girl once, curious, playful, arranging dolls in her nursery. A woman once, lonely, veiled, carrying a crooked crown. A queen once, enduring whispers, enduring remedies, enduring her husband's turned face. Science explains, but it does not soothe. Her life remains both a case study and a tragedy. And as the final embers of her story fade tonight, you carry her with you into the silence. You hear the whispers of her court, the scrape of iron braces, the toll of funeral bells. You see the crooked shadow stretching still from candlelit halls into your quiet room. She is gone, but she is not gone. The hunchback queen remains, a reminder that history does not only crown the perfect, it crowns the broken too. So close your eyes now. Imagine her crooked figure dissolving into soft mist, her bent spine straightened at last. You are safe here, in your own bed, far from the weight of dynasties and the cruelty of whispers. Let your breath slow, deeper and steadier, as if the night itself exhales around you. Picture a quiet chapel, candles extinguished, only the lingering scent of wax in the air. Picture a gallery where portraits sleep under dust, their painted eyes closing at last. Picture a garden at dusk, where flowers bow their heads not from frailty but from peace. The Queen's story is finished, and though her life bent beneath burdens no one should bear, your life tonight bends only toward rest. She leaves you not with sorrow, but with a hush, the kind of hush that comes when history itself grows weary and lays its head down. So let go now, drift with the hum of your fan, the softness of your pillow, the steady rhythm of your own heart. The crooked crown falls away, the whispers dissolve, only silence remains,